Hi, I'm Jim Ferris, the director of the Center on Philanthropy and Public Policy at USC. I have the pleasure today to chat with my colleague, Nick Duquette. Nick's an associate professor in the Price School and a faculty fellow of the center. Nick is an economist and a historian who is an expert in charitable giving, among other topics germane to understanding the nonprofit sector. Nick, recently there's been a lot of conversation about charitable giving and what's happening to it. And we've noticed that there's a smaller number of households giving, but yet the amount of giving has gone up. Can you sort of explain that sort of paradox?
Sure. The way that you can resolve the paradox is that while some people have been less likely to give or giving less, people who give a lot of money are giving more. And so what my research has found working with co-authors, where we have looked across many decades of data on charitable giving in the U.S., is that over time, the people who make very large gifts are giving more and beyond that, giving a greater percentage of all the giving that is going on. That's how charitable giving has managed to stay stable, even though the percentage of people who actually make a gift year to year has been declining over time.
So what's the significance of this change in that a smaller number of people are really driving most of the giving? What does that mean for the recipients of gifts?
Of course. It means that the organizations that receive those gifts are drawing on a smaller and less diverse pool of donors than they might wish to or than we might expect. Traditionally, we think of charitable giving as a social phenomenon that is broadly shared and part of our civic fabric. But in reality, organizations are becoming more dependent on a shrinking pool of donors, and that may make them more dependent on those individual givers and more sensitive to what their major donors would like them to do.
Could you talk about what are the forces behind these trends, and are there public policies that might be able to mitigate some of these new patterns of giving?
Definitely. We have good reason to think that part of the reason we see this pattern is simply the changes in the distribution of income and the distribution of wealth. Exactly how much more unequal U.S. society has become depends on who you ask and how they decide to crunch the numbers. But there's a general consensus that income is concentrated in fewer hands than it was decades ago. Wealth is concentrated in fewer hands. And so it's not surprising that philanthropy is coming to a greater extent from that handful of people who are better off than the 1% of decades ago. But that's not sufficient to explain it. There definitely is something else going on that is not just a story of rich people getting richer and being more a greater share of philanthropy. There also is it seems a generational change where there are fewer of those donors in the middle. The people who were not writing the big checks to a foundation, but who were sustaining their local organizations. And so part of what is frustrating policymakers and analysts is trying to understand where did those middle donors go, and how can we make this something that is a broadly shared part of American life again. We don't necessarily know what the magic answer might be, but there are some thoughtful approaches that policymakers and analysts are suggesting to try to change it. A big part of that is changes in the tax treatment for charitable contributions. After the 2017 reform, without trying to get into the weeds, essentially the tax benefit for making a charitable contribution really became went from being something that about a third of households could take and get something useful out of to about 9%. And so there are proposals both in the think tank space and in Congress and in my own policy writings that have suggested that if we could broaden that access to that type of tax treatment, then that might get people off the bench and convince them to make a small gift today, which could turn into a habit of giving tomorrow.
Some people observe from this pattern that philanthropy is only being done by the wealthy, and that they really don't need an incentive to give. So we ought to just take it away because the government's paying in terms of the tax treatment.
Well, The fact that only the wealthy benefit from the charitable deduction is a policy choice. Essentially, the way we have set the current deduction up is that it is a so-called itemized deduction, which means that when people sit down and do their tax forms or have the preparer do their tax forms, there's a separate list of deductions, the big ones being state taxes, charitable giving, and mortgage interest. And it's really only worth your while to file that form and claim those deductions if adding all those things together is more than the so-called standard deduction, a fixed amount that everybody is allowed to take. So it's not surprising that high-income people and rich people not only do more philanthropy, but they also are paying more state and local taxes, and they have bigger, more expensive mortgages. So they are more likely to benefit from all three of those deductions than the great swaths of the American middle class. And so the reason why the deduction has become a special privilege of the rich is because in 2017, the standard deduction was increased, which then meant you had to have more of these other deductions in order to get over the bar. So the current situation where only high-income people are able to benefit from that deduction was a policy choice that we made. We decided that we wanted to increase this other benefit to the middle class with the side effect of reducing the value of this deduction to other people. And so I don't think it makes sense to say that because of this policy that we've decided to enact, that we therefore need to change policy in reaction to our own decisions. We can change the deduction so that everybody could take it, or that so at least a greater diversity of people could take it, simply by separating the ability to have a tax incentive for your giving from this situation where it has to exceed the standard deduction.
So as you think about giving in the U.S. over time, what are the questions that spark your interest that have implications for the health of the nonprofit sector?
Great question. To me, the interesting role of the nonprofit sector is what it says about our civil society. The U.S. is unique in having this very robust and independent third sector that isn't quite business and it's not government, it's its own thing. And it's a vehicle for a variety of motivations that people have to improve their communities and to change society in a way that they think would make things better. And so when we study these organizations, really what we are understanding is what types of people want to make changes and what do those changes look like. And so we can see over time that the types of changes that people want to make are evolving, and we can see that through the institutions that they support. So while charitable giving, for example, over the past decades has been relatively stable, more of it is going through secular organizations and less through churches and other houses of worship. We've also seen a shift from donations to local community organizations where the donor is likely to know the organization well on a personal level, to national and international fundraisers that are more politicized and also much larger organizations that operate on a much bigger scale. And that reflects some decisions that people have made about what types of organizations that they would like to support. And so I think as we study these organizations, it's not just important for public policy and for the services that we depend on these organizations to provide. It's also a mirror into what we would like to see provided by these organizations and who we are as a country and as a society.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.